Did you know that E-M10 Mark II has a targeting AF pad? About the targeting AF pad and 4 other tips coming up. And before we start, these tips, most of them works also in other OMD cameras. Coming up. Hi there, my name is Peter Forsgard and I am a professional photographer from Helsinki, Finland. Before we get into the targeting AF pad, let's talk about a few other tips first. Let's start with MySets. Tip number 1, MySets. MySets is a very good way of storing your camera settings to a kind of like a memory slot or whatever you would call them. E-M10 Mark II has MySets like most of the older OMD cameras have. For example, like OMD E-M5 Mark II has also MySets. And here is the way to set them up. And tip number 2, multifunction button. By default, the multifunction button is FN2. And what it does is it has different features that can be turned on from the multifunction button. Well, that's kind of obvious because it's called multifunction button. The way it works is if you press it down, it will choose the latest feature that you have used with the multifunction button. And by default, it's the shadow highlight. But if you hold it down and turn the back wheel, then you can choose which feature you will control from the multifunction button. And the default settings are, of course, the first one is the highlight shadow. Then you have color creator, ISO and white balance, and magnify and image aspect. You can change the multifunction features from special menu D. Well, the only additional is the SOVF, which is kind of like a simulates optical viewfinder if you prefer using that in some cases. The other option is to switch the way you control ISO and white balance. Is it the front wheel or the back wheel? You can switch this, for your likings. And that's what I really like about the Olympus cameras, that you can customize it to your likings, because we all are a bit different when we do images and we need different things because of the way we shoot and the genres and everything like that. And that's really a good thing, that you have the ability to customize the camera. Have you ever used this multifunction setting? What are your favorite settings or features that you have on your multifunction button? And if you haven't used it, is there any reason? You might not know about it, or you just don't need it. I use it sometimes mainly for the highlight shadow. That's something that I might change sometimes if I want to, but very seldom, to be honest, I use this button. But it's a good thing to have it there. And tip number 3, electronic zoom speed. If you have the electronic zoom kit lens, then this is very useful for you. Did you know that you can change the electronic zoom speed? The default is normal, and then you have settings for low and high, and these same settings are for video too. For stills, I think it depends on your way of shooting, how fast you want the field of view change, or how slow you want it to change. The slower it is, the more precise you can do, which I like, because I'm not a really big fan of electronic zooms because of it's not really precise, and it's really hard to get exact if you want to make the crop exactly, or the composition exactly the way you've decided. It's really hard to choose the right focal length for that. Of course, you can walk closer or further away, but that's a bit different. It's not the same thing. But on video, I think the low is the best, because then the transition is slower. It might be too fast, but that also depends on the genre you're doing. If you're doing music videos, then a fast zoom might be a lot better, but in most cases the slower is better. And here you can see what the difference is with low, normal and fast. Choose the one that suits your way of shooting. Have you ever used this feature that you have set the different speeds for your electronic zoom? Please let me know in the comments down below. Before we go to another tip about MySets, let's talk about targeting AF pad, the thing that I said in the beginning of this video. It's a very handy way of making the not the exposure, I'm always saying exposure, it's the very handy way of making AF. even when you're using the EVF. Of course, if you're using the LCD on the back, then you can tap the screen and choose where to focus. But if you're using EVF, the way you do it, you just use the EVF as your viewfinder and then move your thumb on the LCD and it will change the position of the AF point. And you turn the targeting AF pad on from special menu A. It's the last one. Just turn it on and it's enabled. And then you can start using it. And this is really handy in many situations. And I haven't really used it that much. But lately I actually have, because I've been starting to pick up my favorite genre of photography, street photography. I've been done that lately because it's something that I really like, and I haven't done it for a few years now. For a reason that I don't know, I just haven't. Now I've picked it up again. And there it's very handy to when you have the camera and then just move the thumb to change the focusing point. And that can also be used in many other genres, for example, in landscape, of course, in cityscapes. And it's also a very good way if let's say that you're photographing your kids, you can kind of move the focusing point where the kids is moving. Of course, you need to practice it a bit. It's not that easy. If the subject is moving really fast, then you really need to practice it. But start using it and you will get hang of it. And if you don't like it, then don't use it. That's what I think. You should use things that suits your needs best. But it's always good to try different things because you might find this very useful. But of course, I want to know, have you used it? Because it's one of those things that not too many people use. And if you have, please let me know in the comments down below. And how have you find it? Is it convenient for you, or maybe you've tried it and not used it? Tell me that also in the comments down below. But let's get into the tip number 5. And after that, I will have an extra tip, which is, of course, a very handy tip, and it works with any OMD camera. Number 5 is about the MySets. Did you know that you can set MySets to the mode dial? For example, if you never use art modes, like I very seldom use. I've tried them, but it's not something that I use at all because I don't like them. They are a bit cheesy, to be honest. You can assign, for example, MySet 1 to the art mode in mode dial. That's a good way when you are, experimenting with the camera and, all that. And then you just turn on the art mode and you will have MySets on that. You will have your basic settings on that. And then you might want to assign to the SCN something else that you have set your camera for, something else. Let's say that you want a continuous autofocus and certain other features on, and then you have the basic settings. Set the other one to SCN and the other one to art modes, or wherever you like them. And I think that's a good way of storing your camera settings, so that if you are changing something, then just turn it back to art mode and you have MySets number 1 assigned to that feature or that thing on the mode dial. You will have your basic settings, because I know a lot of people ask me questions that they have changed something and now something's not working. And yeah, that happens to me sometimes. You wonder, why is this grayed out? And then I've tested something and then that's why I, for example, in my E-M1 Mark III, I have all my basic settings on C1. And with E-M10 Mark II, you can do the same thing. Just set it to a place in mode dial and you're always good to go with your basic settings. It's unfortunate that E-M10 Mark III, this feature does not exist. They've for some reason taken it out. Don't know why. It's a bad decision, because I think this is actually a very good feature. And then the extra tip. Use P mode. Okay, this might be a shock for someone, because usually I always recommend to use either A mode or manual. It depends on your way of shooting. On P mode, you can change the exposure very easily. Just turn back wheel, you will change what's set there. I've set the exposure compensation on there, and then on the front wheel, I can change the aperture. So it's actually the same way, but the difference is that it will give you a quite good starting point for exposure, and then just use the histogram to adjust the exposure correctly. So, or use that as a reference so you know that the exposure is correct. Because having a correct exposure is really important. And of course, correct exposure is the exposure that you want without any further or massive tweaking in post. But I think P, which actually when you turn the wheel changes to PS, is a very handy way. And it's like combining manual and all the other exposure modes to one place. And I think this is very good way of doing it. And I haven't really used it in the past, this P mode, that much, because I really kind of didn't realize that how convenient it actually is. But later, as I said, I've been starting using or making more street photography, and I've had the PS or the P mode on in most cases. I think that's a good way. I hope these tips were useful. Which one was your favorite? And here is something else about the E-M10 Mark II that you can watch. But hey, thanks for watching, and bye for now.